What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this is going to be a pretty fun one. Now, I released a video recently going over the card packs, Cyberdark Impact and Power of the Duelist, and one of the comments on it by frequent guest of the channel, Hoy, mentioned, I'm curious to see how those packs will actually rank in my GX pack ranking, and that actually made me realize I didn't actually go through and rate the sort of DM era packs of the Yu-Gi-Oh trading card game. And that's something that I thought would be pretty interesting to do. So I figured I'd, sort of make a tier list for the older Yu-Gi-Oh packs. Now, if you don't know, the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG is sort of divided up into different pack eras. Oftentimes, in the initial packs, they're divided up into different anime eras. So the quote-unquote DM era is the era that basically had like Yu-Gi on the front. Mainly, that did change over time. But basically, it's the packs that came out while the first Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime series was airing, basically. There are some sort of subtleties there, and there are some disagreements between different groups of people as to whether the later packs are still in this sort of classification. But that's the general sort of idea of this sort of pack ranking, going through the different packs from this time period and just ranking them on a given scale. Now, I could have just done a typical tier list like S tier to F tier, right, of that sort of thing. But I feel like, specifically for the DM era, there actually are a couple different aspects that make these sets what they are. On one level, there's the idea of how iconic are they? Are they stuff that we remember, if we were kids at the time opening up packs, or are they things that like older players passed down to newer generations saying like, oh, I remember this set was, game breaking or like iconic or whatever. So I do think that that does deserve to be a metric that we measure by, but there's also the level of like, how game warping are they? Are the cards in them actually like really, really strong, or are they just iconic that they've got a lot of anime cards, but the cards in them didn't really make an impact at the time? So I decided, instead of doing a typical tier list, I would sort of place them on this chart. You can view it as sort of like a political alignment chart for Yu-Gi-Oh! Trading card packs, although instead of being political alignment, we've got game warping to filler on the x-axis, and then iconic to this exists on the y-axis here. So I figured that I would just, go through each set and rank them very quickly, give my thoughts on why I'm placing them in a given spot and see how that actually turns out. Now, this is the first time doing a video like this, so who knows how the finished product is going to look. It could look very, very cluttered visually, but I'll try and make it look as visually appealing as possible. And also, if you like this sort of thing, definitely subscribe to the channel. I occasionally do this sort of thing, but I mainly focus on old gameplay videos. But, I do have discussion videos and rankings like this. And also let me know what you think about my rankings down in the comments below. Where do you disagree? Where do you agree? I'd love to hear it. So let's dive in to the ranking here. And we're going to start off with the OG pack here, if I can get it to work. This is the first time using this sort of setup here, and there are a lot of packs to sort of get these layers there. There we go. Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon, the OG Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG set. Now, this was a major, major deal when it came out. Had a lot of iconic cards. Blue Eyes White Dragon, Dark Magician, etc. Makes sense to the first pack. So, of course, it would be the most iconic cards from the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime coming out first. But it also had some very, very strong cards in terms of just gameplay-wise. I mean, you had 4 of the Power 5 limited cards initially. Pot of Greed, Dark Hole, Raigeki, Monster Reborn, all in this set. And, I mean, this was the first set, so by definition, it warped the game around it because this was all people had to play with. So I will be ranking this up all the way up in the right-hand corner here. I'm going to put it in iconic and gameplay warping. I think it has to go, like, all the way up there at the top because, I mean, this is the iconic pack of this era. It still is legendary to this day. So I think that this card deserves its spot there for sure. Next up, we have a pack that's a bit less iconic, but it's still very, very good. And I'm really regretting how I laid out this thing, but I'm going to keep this in so that way the people know how this sort of turned out. But anyway, we got Metal Raiders. Metal Raiders was the second pack released, and you may notice if you're very in tune to the Yu-Gi-Oh timeline that I skipped over Stardex, Yu-Gi, and Kaiba, which were both impactful in their own right. But I'm just focusing on the packs here. Maybe in the future, I'll do a ranking system for just the Yu-Gi-Oh promo products as well. But I just like doing the packs here instead. So Metal Raiders is still a very, very good pack, and it is iconic in its own way. I mean, it had Summoned Skull in the pack. Summoned Skull came out in the starter decks beforehand, but, same with Change of Heart. But those still were in the packs. It had Mirror Force in this pack, which is iconic. Solemn Judgment, iconic card as well. But beyond those, like, it does sort of wade into the non-iconic territory. Of course, there are still anime cards like Black Skull Dragon, which is on the cover, of course. And I mean, I don't know. There are things like, I guess, with Thousand Dragon in the back, there are just a variety of cards that like are related to the anime in this thing. I think Thousand Dragon was in this pack along with Time Wizard, I believe. I think they were both in this pack. But unfortunately, it just doesn't quite have the same iconic quality as Legend of Blue Eyes. So I don't really think it's the most iconic thing in the world. I do think it's more iconic than not. So I am just going to be placing this a bit higher than 0 in the iconic scale there. But I do think gameplay-wise, it was extremely game warping. I would actually put it like on a similar scale to Legend of Blue Eyes in terms of gameplay. Let's get this. I mean, yeah, we can place it under the text there. But I do think that it is a similar level of gameplay. And, to explain why that is, to explain why that is, basically, I covered the old formats that basically arose from these packs and the cards that were out at the time on the channel. Definitely check those out. And going from the first format in the game, which was, Yu-Gi Kaiba format, which is basically Legend Blue Eyes plus some starter deck cards, to the second format in the game, Critter format, which is basically just adding Metal Raiders, was a major, major difference. Yu-Gi Kaiba is definitely Playground Yu-Gi-Oh! At its finest. It's very, very sort of like beat stick oriented, caveman style Yu-Gi-Oh! But Critter format, there's a lot more complexity and depth. You have things like Sangam, which is Black Forest, that, create a resource chain for you. You have things like Muka Muka and Mass Sorcerer, which make their own sort of decks, Mass Control and Muka Muka Turbo. And there's a lot of very interesting things that you can do with the cards in this set. Now, I should also explain at this point that when I say game warping, I mean game warping for the time it came out. So if a pack has a bunch of powerful cards that only really became super powerful later in the game's history, I'm not really going to consider that aspect of them for the purpose of this ranking here. But I do think that Metal Raiders was very, very impactful at the time. Obviously not as impactful gameplay-wise as Legend of Blue Eyes, but nothing will be as impactful as that because that was the very first set in the game. But I do think it does deserve to be all the way over here to the extreme end of game warping because it was just so, so strong at warping the game in that way. But next up, we have Magic Ruler, Spell Ruler, whatever you want to call it, whenever I get it above the layer here. There we go. Oh, that's not the right one. That's Danger Sanctuary. Bear with me, folks. I'm trying to do the best I can here. There it is. I mixed up they've got similar color schemes a bit. There we go. Magic Ruler, Spell Ruler, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to shrink this down a little bit, but this pack was another very, very cool pack. I mean, it's partially iconic because it had the whole snafu where it originally came out as Magic Ruler, but then because they were worried about lawsuits from Wizards of the Coast with Magic the Gathering, they switched it to Spell Ruler. So that makes it iconic in that way. It had Relinquish, which was a very, very iconic card. It had the hand rips, which, are very, very frightening for a lot of people from this time. But I do think that overall, it's not quite as iconic as Metal Raiders and Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. So I do think that it's more just, at 0 here in terms of the iconic, and this exists like right in between on this sort of like Y = 0 line here. But I do think gameplay-wise, it was relatively game warping. It did provide the hand rips, which were very, very powerful. It provided MST, which is also very good. Up until that point, the only spell and trap removal we had was like Heavy Storm for Metal Raiders, and then like Dispel and Remove Trap or Trap Master things from Legend of Blue Eyes. And MST was a very, very flexible card, so it became played in a lot of decks. But I do think that overall, I mean, it also had like Missed Tomatoes and things like that, so the recruiters as well. But I think overall, like those cards were very good and did warp decks around them. But, in terms of how the game actually changed, I think it feels very, very similar to how it was in Critter format. And the format based around Magic Ruler Treasure format doesn't really have too much different stuff going on here. So I think in terms of game warping, I'm going to place it, I think I'll place it like here. It was definitely more on the game warping side than the filler side. But it wasn't like super, super game warping like some of the other sets, like Metal Raiders and Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon. But still, that's pretty good that it's above the filler end of the spectrum. And I think that that applies to a lot of these DM era sets in that, like, a lot of them were, very, very, had powerful cards in them, right? Like, even if it was only 1 or 2 cards, oftentimes those cards could warp the game quite a bit. And I really think that there's no better example of that than the next set we have here, which is Pharaoh's Servant. Now, this set is very, very... I mean, I don't necessarily think it's iconic. I think it's part of the issue is that there's Pharaonic Guardian as well. So like Pharaoh's Servant, Pharaonic Guardian, they sound similar. So that already lowers its sort of iconic feature. But the card in it that came out, Jinzo, was very iconic. So, I'm not going to put it like at pure... I mean, I'm going to put it pretty far down in terms of like iconic that this exists. But you know, it is iconic among certain people, but I think in general, this set is one of the first ones that people like really forget if they're just listing out the sets in order from memory. I feel like Pharaoh's Servant is the first stumbling block for them. And I think it makes sense because outside of like Jinzo and Imperial Order, honestly, a lot of things from Pharaoh's Servant were not really that good. You did have other things like I think Gravity Bind came out in the set as well. So it's not like there's nothing here, but I think in terms of game warping ability, you know, it isn't the biggest game warping thing. I think it's probably just on this like y-axis here, you know, x equals 0, because like it really did add Jinzo and Io, and that's basically it to the meta. Of course, you know, limited removal is a bit of a jank card that you can play in it, I guess, as well. But like realistically, you know, going from, you know, Treasure format, which is the one based around Magic Ruler, to Imperial form, which is the one based around the new cards from Pharaoh's Servant, didn't really change too much overall. I mean, Imperial Order and Nobleman of Crossout and Jinzo and Death Tornado are the big ones. But besides that, there's not really anything here. Oh, Premature Burial, I guess. So I guess there are some. Call of the Haunted as well. And this just shows how uniconic this set is, that despite having all those powerful cards, it's very easy to forget they came from this too. But I do think that a lot of those cards were not quite as good as at the time, especially because you already had Monster Reborn. So Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted, while good, were not really as, you know, game warping as they might otherwise be. I think the big thing game warping wise is Nock, Jinzo, and Io. And I think that those, while powerful, still led to formats that felt very similar to what came before them. So I do think I'm just going to place it like right here. So it's like a bit low on the iconic to this exist spectrum. It wasn't the most game warping thing in the world, but it's still not quite filler, right? It's definitely more on the game warping side than the filler side. Or so I guess maybe like here. Yeah, I'll put it here. That feels right to me. So we're kind of having a weird sort of trend where like these two are very, the iconicness is sort of going down over time. And the game warping thing is sort of like, it's almost like, you know, exponential decay sort of here. But that will probably change in the future, especially when the next set is revealed, which is Labyrinth of Nightmare here. And Labyrinth of Nightmare is one of those sets that like, I do think Labyrinth of Nightmare is not very iconic. Just like Pharaoh's Servant, it's just kind of like something that exists overall. I don't really think that most people remember it. So honestly, it might even be lower than Pharaoh's Servant in terms of people remembering it. Also, like, it's not helped by the fact that the cover card is Mask of Restrict. It's not even a monster, which is interesting. That's the first set that does not have a cover card that's a monster here, but it is like definitely more forgettable than some of the others. So I'm going to put it like down below the Pharaoh's Servant in terms of like this exists thing. But despite it being kind of obscure, it actually did release a couple cards that really did change the game quite a bit, in my opinion. And those would be things like the beaters, right? Gemini Elf, Kaiju the Ghost Destroyer, Bazoo the Soul Eater. Those cards, you might not even know what they are if you haven't played the older formats of the game's history or weren't around at the time. But they were a set of beaters that were very powerful. And up until this point, the best beater in the game was like Jinzo. Other monsters, you just like potentially value them for attack stats in the case of like Mechanical Chaser or Lodgin or something like that. Or they'd be things like Sangan and Witch, or powerful flip monster like Magician of Faith or something like that. Where they'd have effects, but they wouldn't necessarily be the thing that is like carrying the game forward on its back, right? And in Labyrinth of Nightmare, I really do think the beaters do become things that carry the game forward on their back. The removal tends to shift towards monsters, right? Like Gemini Elf can beat over a Kaiju the Ghost Destroyer, which can beat over a Bazoo Soul Eater, which can beat over a Gemini Elf, and that dynamic becomes a major factor in Android format, which is the format based around Labyrinth of Nightmare. And I do think that Android format feels very different from all the formats that came before it. Just because you do have a much faster pace of play with the monsters just also having a lot more attack on average. So games go a lot quicker. But also having that interesting monster dynamic where for the first time in the game's history, you know, monsters are starting to rival things like traps or spells or things like that. Still not quite overtaking them. Like spells are still definitely the most powerful card in the game. But they are at a point where like, you do have a set of monsters that are like really powerful in a lot of different decks. So I do think that this set is pretty game warping, not quite as game warping as like Metal Raiders or Legend of Blue Eyes. But I think it does belong down here, which is a very interesting sector of the graph. I felt like not many sets would actually wind up in the game warping, yet this exists section. But apparently Labyrinth of Nightmare is the first one to do that. And honestly, the next set might also be in sort of a similar spot here. So the next set we've got is the Legacy of Darkness, which also has a trap as a cover card on the cover. That's kind of interesting. I didn't realize that that happened twice in a row. Legacy of Darkness, I feel like this is also one that sort of belongs in the this exists section. A lot of the ones like from the middle of the DM era, I think do belong in this period because a lot of people just do forget about them, you know? Even though they had powerful cards, there weren't as many iconic anime cards in them. And so, you know, a lot of people, you know, sort of let them fall by the wayside. But I do think that this set is somewhat game warping. It had a lot of powerful cards in it. It had Exiled Force, it had Fiber Jar, it had Injection Fairy Lily, just to name a few. Had Gatagarasu, so that's a major card that would be a major threat later on in the game. And it still is a threat in like Fiber format, which is the format based around Legacy of Darkness. But it is less scary than it will eventually become. I still think that this makes it a very game warping set. Not necessarily as game warping as Labyrinth of Nightmare, in my opinion, because I do think that Fiber and Android are like somewhat similar. So I will, you know, not quite be placing this as high in the game warping spectrum here, but I do think it sort of belongs right around Labyrinth of Nightmare. I'm not sure if it's like more or less iconic. I feel like Legacy of Darkness is slightly more iconic, just because the name is very powerful. You know, a lot of people liked the dark themes of Yu-Gi-Oh! I feel like Legacy of Darkness sticks in your mind more than Labyrinth of Nightmare. But also part of the issue with these sets is that their set codes were LON and then LOD, so very similar set codes as well, which did not allow them to stand out really. So yeah, I think neither of these are really that iconic, but I do think that it probably belongs somewhere here in between Pharaoh Servant and Labyrinth of Nightmare in terms of game warping potential. But moving on to the next set, we've got Pharaonic Guardian, and Pharaonic Guardian is another one of those sets where it's like, it did release some good cards, like Rain Destruction, Spirit Reaper, Dawn Zalug. The Gravekeeper archetype came out in this set as well. So there are a lot of good cards in this set. Trap Death Shoot as well, but Trap Death Shoot was not really played as much at the time because you had the just better hand rips in general. So Pharaonic Guardian, yeah, I think it does lead to one of the best formats in the DM era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is Yata format, which is very popular format from the time. Great gameplay going on in it. And a lot of that does come down to the new cards in Pharaonic Guardian. But I think in terms of like how it warped the game, Yata does feel somewhat similar to how it was in Fiber format. I think the big thing is some differences in the ban list, like limiting Graceful Charity instead of having it semi-limited. And that's not really Pharaonic Guardian's fault. That's just the ban list fault. And also some changes to how certain cards work with different erratas, like changing the way the Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer and Bazoo the Soul Eater work, which also shifted the balance that was in Fiber format. So I think this set did not really actually impact the game too much in terms of game warping ability. It still impacted a little bit. So it's not quite at the bottom of filler, but I do think it's like probably around here. And also in terms of like this existing or not, it sort of falls into the similar thing that I mentioned with Pharaoh's Servant, where like, you know, they have very similar set names. So people do tend to forget about this one. So I do think it's on the low end of iconic and also sort of on the lower end of, you know, the game warping to filler spectrum as well. But I'll place that right here. So it's the first of the pack that actually falls into this quadrant of the graph, which is kind of interesting. But I will say, like, just because it wasn't really the most impactful set in the world, and also it wasn't the most iconic set in the world, you know, definitely check out Yata format. Yata format is one of my favorite formats from this time period. So definitely check that out. But moving on from Pharaonic Guardian, we get a set that is, I mean, this is definitely a divisive set for sure. And that is Magician's Force. Now, Magician's Force is overall, I think, in my opinion, like, not really the best set. I think most of the cards in it were like not really too powerful, and just sort of anime filler. That being said, like there are some iconic anime strats in it, and like Dark Paladin's the cover card. Dark Magician Girl comes out in this set. So I do think in terms of like the iconic to this exist spectrum, it actually is more on the iconic side than a lot of the other packs here, because they are leaning more into the anime for this sort of thing, and that does make this set more iconic. But I think in terms of the game warping to filler spectrum, you might think that because I said most of the cards in this set are not really that good, it would fall more on the filler spectrum. But it did release Magical Scientist, Break of the Magical Warrior, and Tribe Infecting Virus. And those cards definitely did change the game quite a bit. They made the game a lot faster. Again, more powerful beaters coming out, increasing the pace of play, but Magical Scientist specifically opening up the realm to FTKs. And Magical Scientist was at 3 copies when this first came out for some reason. So yeah, I think that this leads to a pretty bad format overall, but it does get warp the format around magical scientists and things like that. So I do think it's on the game warping side and also the iconic side. So I am going to place it. Is it more iconic than Metal Raiders? Probably not more iconic than Metal Raiders. So I think maybe probably like here. Yeah, it's definitely more game warping than Magic Ruler in my opinion. Not as game warping or iconic as Metal Raiders in my opinion, but I do think it is like somewhat close. Or maybe Metal Raiders should just be higher. Whoa, didn't realize it would do that. Maybe this should just be higher up there. Yeah, let me know about the exact placements here. I think overall it is sort of more like a vibe sort of thing in terms of the exact placement on the graph. And just comparatively, right? Like I can compare Magician Force to Metal Raiders in terms of like iconicness, right? And game warpingness. And just like I can with Magic Ruler and Magician Force as well. So, yeah, a lot of this will just be comparative. Don't expect like solid, like, nail down. This is the exact quantitative score here. But hopefully qualitatively it makes sense. Anyways, moving from Magician's Force, we then get Dark Crisis. And this set I do think is like actually more iconic than a lot of the sets from around the time it came out. I don't really know why. I think it was just like, you had a lot of good common cards. You had like Sacred Armors coming out, which was something that everyone could play on the playground as just a battle trip. Some major competitive decks also played it, but in general, it was more of a playground deck at the time because you just had more powerful removal in general. But having that, very cheap removal that was very easy to access was very, very nice for a lot of people. Also had Exodia Necros on the cover. Anything with Exodia makes it more iconic. You had a lot of, DD Warrior Ladies running around as well. Vampire Lord was a secret from this as well. So I do think Dark Crisis was a pretty iconic set. In terms of gameplay, I do think that the DD Warrior Ladies were good. But I think overall, it doesn't really change that much. I think the aggressive pace that it sort of brings to the table with DD Warrior Lady is important to note. But I'm not really sure if it's quite as aggressive as the change from Magician's Force. So I do think it's less impactful gameplay-wise than Magician's Force, but it is slightly more iconic. Maybe I just need to move... Oh my goodness, why does this keep happening to me? See, this is the first time I'm using this in like a photo editing software here. So definitely a bit of growing pains there. But I do think that it does belong below Metal Raiders in terms of iconicness. So I'm just going to keep moving Metal Raiders up further and further up the iconic scale, I guess, as I sort of compare these. But I do think that it is above Magician Force in terms of iconicness, but less in terms of gameplay warping. And also, like, less than Magic Ruler as well. I think it's slightly more than Pharaoh Servant, a little bit, but still around that region there for it. But moving on from Dark Crisis, we get to probably one of the other sets that people can name by name, just, even if you're not really as familiar with this era, and that is Invasion of Chaos. This thing was a monster of a set. Very, very powerful stuff. This introduced the Chaos Monsters, but even outside the Chaos Monsters, there were so many powerful cards for a variety of different decks and strategies. I mean, Berserk Gorilla came out in this thing. You had, like, Dimension Fusion. You had Levia Dragon Daedalus in this for some reason. You had a lot of different cards here. And if the Chaos Monsters hadn't come out as well, then a lot of those probably would have taken over the meta. But as is, this set really broke Yu-Gi-Oh's history, right? And this was part of the reason why we got the Forbidden list. Before that, it was just the limited list. No cards were banned. But Invasion of Chaos changed that. So I do think that this belongs up there with Legend of Blue Eyes, right in the same sort of category. Of course, not quite as iconic and not quite as gameplay warping as it, but definitely like, that sort of area there. And because it's the newer one, I'm just going to place it right there in terms of just the iconicness and gameplay warpingness of it. It's so, so strong. So this is definitely, I think, the second most iconic and second most game warping set of the DM era. But we still got some other fun sets to talk about. We got 4 more sets to talk about here. And, the DM era did not end at Invasion of Chaos. That's a common misconception I think that people have because Invasion of Chaos was so powerful. And actually, even before the ban list came out, there was another set that was released, Ancient Sanctuary. So you could argue that Ancient Sanctuary was what made Konami institute a ban list. But the cards from Ancient Sanctuary were not what caused Konami to do it. It was mainly just, the timing of it. But Ancient Sanctuary, it had some good stuff. It had Zaborg, the Thunder Monarch. It had Monster Gate. So Enemy Controller as well. So it had some stuff in it. I do think, though, on the whole, it does sort of fall more into this quadrant here, more on the filler side of things than the game warping side of things, because the big fallout was just Invasion of Chaos. And I think, honestly, a lot of the cards in Ancient Sanctuary were sort of like, you know, a lot weaker than the cards in Invasion of Chaos because they were trying to course correct a little bit and be like, okay, we can't release another, like, insanely strong set now, so we got to weaken the power level a little bit here. So I do think that this is more on the filler side. And also, I don't really think it's the most iconic thing in the world. I think it does fall into the same quadrant as Pharaonic Guardian here. Probably a bit less impactful as a Pharaonic Guardian. Maybe even less iconic too. Honestly, yeah, I'm just feeling right here, honestly. In terms of just where it falls on the scale, I think it's like a little bit less iconic than Pharaonic Guardian and also a little less game warping. So I do think it just belongs right there. But that's all that to say, yeah, it still is a fun set. I mean, and it will have cards that will become much, much more important later on in the game once a lot of other things are banned. But again, it is more how it impacts things at the time it came out. And at the time it came out, it was just sort of like a blip on the radar, really. So I'm just going to put it there. Now we move on to some of these smaller packs in this era. And this was mainly because before this point, you know, we'd been getting basically lump sets of OCG sets. So basically they combine multiple OCG sets together. But starting with Soul of the Duelist, you got sets that were starting to be just basically ported over exactly from the OCG. Not quite exactly, I think, but you know, you did have some similarities there in terms of pack size and what was in them. This was a much smaller set. And following the trend set by Ancient Sanctuary, it did not really have much good stuff in it. It had Mobius in it. I think it had the horse cards as well in it. The LV archetype in general was in the set. That was where it got start. But I think overall this set was not really that good. I think I'm going to put it, honestly, like we're sort of on a downward trend here, but I do think that this is less iconic than Ancient Sanctuary and also more of a filler set than Ancient Sanctuary as well. So I do think this belongs down here, just in this corner. So, you know, it's interesting because we started out, you know, a lot of iconic sets, a lot of powerful game warping sets. Then we sort of had this region here filled out in sort of the beginning part of the middle of the DM era. And then, you know, we occasionally jumped into this quadrant with like Pharaonic Guardian, but things, you know, ramp back up to this section again. But now we're sort of back in this bottom left quadrant here. And unfortunately, it's just going to stay there for a while as we've got Rise of the Duelist here, or Rise of Destiny, that's what it is. And this also had some iconic cards in it. Thestalos said Creator. Dekoichi was in this set. But again, just like with Soul of the Duelist, it was a much smaller set, and there wasn't really much going on gameplay-wise. So I don't really think that this changed things too much in terms of gameplay. I think it's honestly like about the same as Soul of the Duelist here. So, maybe even slightly worse because I think Mobius is a better Monarch than Thestalos, but you could argue that Dekoichi was a better card than a lot of the other cards in Soul of the Duelist. I'm just going to sort of put them like, you know, together. So they're basically in the same slot. So you can have either of these there, whichever one you want in that spot. I think they're basically identical in terms of iconicness and also in terms of just power level. Now we get to the last set of the DM era, and this is something that, you know, some people might disagree with me on. Some people call Flaming Eternity the first set of the GX era. In my opinion, the Lost Millennium is the first set of the GX era. And I know a lot of people also agree with that sort of statement as well. But there is debate on this back and forth. Different sources classify it as different ways. I do think it is a DM era set, but, you know, if you want to argue it's GX, then you can argue it's GX. Either way, my ranking here won't really change based on this. I do think it is a somewhat iconic set because it's the first set without Yugi on the cover of it. And also it features the Sacred Phoenix of Nephthys, that is. And that's a very iconic card. So I do think this is slightly more iconic than some of the other ones that were listed here, but I do still think it is on the pack filler side of things. Nephthys is something. Rescue Cat was in this set. You had Phoenix from Moonblast in this set. You had a couple of interesting cards here, but I think overall this is more on the filler side of things yet again. I do think that it is slightly more iconic than some of the other ones here, though. So I am going to put it probably right here. So filling out this quadrant. Interestingly enough, we didn't have any sets that fell into the iconic and filler section here. Let me know down in the comments below if you think any of these packs should have belonged in the iconic filler section of this graph. Because I thought there would be some starting out, but honestly, a lot of the sort of iconic early sets did have just game warping cards in them. So they did fall, into this upper right quadrant as opposed to the upper left. But, I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on this. This wasn't a typical tier list. I didn't have easy answers for all these things where it's like, oh, this is an S tier set, this is an A tier set, etc. But I think it was fun to sort of like rank them qualitatively on this big graph. Let me know what you thought of this sort of ranking video in the comments down below. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this or when I do my GX pack rankings if you want it just to be a more standard tier list. I look forward to discussing with y'all. As always, if you want to play games in any of the formats that I mentioned here, definitely check out the YGO from Zero Discord server in the link in the description down below. And also, if you want to support me directly, I've got a Patreon. If you join the Patreon, you get shout out in these videos. So big shouts to GeoMindFest, Rinswin, Porkchop, Coon, Brendan Donker, Tyler Compton, and Dump Truck. It really means a lot that you all support me this way and encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. I hope that you all enjoyed as always. Until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.